This program is made possible by listeners who choose to support Frontlines and Backrooms. You can join our community of supporters through the link in the episode description. Thank you.
From Lisbon, Frontlines and Backrooms podcast. Your host, Vladimir Bobetic.
This is not a war that spiraled out of control. It is a war that was planned, sold, and expected to end in days. In this conversation, Mouin Rabbani breaks down how a war what was never meant to last is now reshaping the entire region, from the Strait of Hormuz to Lebanon, from Washington to Tehran. We talk about escalation without a plan, negotiations that were never meant to succeed, and a conflict that may ultimately weaken the United States more than its adversaries. And we ask a simple question. If no one planned for what comes next, who controls what happens now? Mouin Rabbani is a non-resident senior fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. He is a researcher, analyst, and a commentator specializing in Palestinian affairs, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and contemporary Middle East politics. He has held senior roles with the United Nations, the International Crisis Group, and the Marty Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, working on political affairs, conflict resolution, and regional analysis. Mr. Rabbani, thank you for your time and welcome back to Frontlines and Backrooms.
Thank you. It's good to be with you again.
There is one thing that has been bothering me since day one of this war. Was this war a war of choice, a war of vanity, a war of necessity, or did somebody go over there to Washington and tell President Trump, listen, this is going to be your second Venezuela, and he believed it?
Well, one doesn't exclude the other. The only one that I would exclude is, of course, a war of necessity. This was very clearly an unprovoked war of aggression. At the same time, it's quite clear that Trump, who we need to constantly remind ourselves is a vacuous individual in accelerated cognitive decline, knows virtually nothing about the Middle East or international relations or statecraft, and as we've now found out, about warfare as well, and was persuaded by senior advisors who wanted to wage this war, working in close collaboration with Israel, who has wanted this war for decades, that it would be over in 3 or 4 days. And it's quite clear. I mean, all the reporting, credible reporting we've seen, demonstrates that when Trump signed off on this war, and he did so after a crucial meeting in February with Netanyahu, he did so in the conviction that it would be not like Venezuela, but similar to Venezuela, that if he could successfully assassinate Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, and a number of other senior leaders, then within 3 to 4 days, the Islamic Republic would either capitulate or collapse. There would be a popular uprising, and it would be all over. And in the worst case, it would take the United States only a few short weeks to eliminate Iran's ballistic missile capability. Now, the other evidence we have for this is that it's become quite clear that the United States never anticipated a significant Iranian response. They did not provide adequate shelter for their service people in the Arab Gulf states. They did not anticipate that the Iranians could or would seek to exercise control over the Strait of Hormuz, and so on. So not only did they not prepare for what everyone has been saying for years would happen, but we also know there was no plan B.
In your recent analysis, you talked about America's war for Greater Israel, the phrase that makes many people uncomfortable, but you've used it deliberately. Walk me through it. What does Greater Israel actually mean in 2026?
Well, I don't know why the phrase Greater Israel is in any way controversial, given that, Israeli advocates of Greater Israel gratuitously use it themselves. If you look at the way that Israelis speak about this issue, they use two different phrases. The first is Medinat Israel, which is the state of Israel, and the other is Eretz Israel, which is the land of Israel. And these are not coterminous because the land they claim for Israel extends well beyond the internationally recognized boundaries of the state of Israel. And, look at the last century, in 1947 the United Nations allocated some 56% of the British Mandate of Palestine to a Jewish state. By 1949, the Israeli military controlled 78% of that territory and didn't relinquish any of it. In 1956, Israel not only occupied the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, but Israeli leaders were openly stating they were going to annex them, and were forced to leave only because of combined U.S. and Soviet pressure on Britain, France, and Israel. In 1967, Israel occupied the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, Syrian Golan Heights, and since then it has annexed East Jerusalem. It has annexed the Golan Heights. It was forced to relinquish the Sinai Peninsula in the aftermath of the 1973 October War, and it is now engaged in an unprecedented campaign of annexation, settlement expansion in the West Bank. And, already in the late 1960s, Israeli leaders were saying, we are here to stay. This is Israeli territory. It's not occupied territory. And in the past 2 years, they have occupied additional territory in Syria and have made clear that they are going to retain this indefinitely. They're calling it a buffer zone, but the way Israel works is that a buffer zone always ends up having civilian settlements and ultimately is subject to annexation. And Israeli leaders are now saying that their northern border is no longer the internationally recognized boundary between Israel and Lebanon, but rather the Litani River, which, by the way, has been an Israeli or a Zionist ambition since the early 20th century. So Greater Israel means a state of Israel that occupies, controls, and seeks to annex and incorporate land far beyond its borders. And that is exactly what's happening. Israeli leaders openly talk about this. So how it is somehow offensive to speak about reality is beyond me.
Well, you know that every criticism of Israel means labeling, and we are all going to end up as anti Semites, which is not true in any way, shape, or form in our case, but it is what it is.
Well, of course. I mean, if any description of reality that is not to the liking of Israel and its apologists is immediately denounced as an anti-Semitic blood libel. I mean, just this week, you had was it an Italian or perhaps Spanish newspaper published um, uh, photograph of a settler harassing Palestinians. It was a real photograph and it was denounced as anti-Semitic and so on, even though there are thousands of photographs exactly like it. You know, a good journalist can only show an Israeli as a victim of a vast international conspiracy, never as the aggressors that they are.
You mentioned Lebanon. Israel occupied the south of Lebanon between 1978 and 2000. Now they are up to the Litani River with mandated evacuation orders now up to the Zahrani River. This time around, is this a permanent occupation? Is this going to end up as a definite annexation of southern Lebanon?
I think that is Israel's intention, and I think it is how Israel would like this to be resolved. But I don't think it's tenable for two reasons. First of all, Israel's formal pretext for occupying this part of Lebanon is to place northern Israel beyond the range of Hezbollah's weaponry. Now, that in the 1960s or 1970s, that may have been a rational approach viewed from a strictly military perspective. But, we're now in a situation where you don't have to be a superpower, where even Hezbollah can hit not only northern Israel, but can hit Tel Aviv and southern Israel from northern Lebanon. So the military value of this territory is precisely zero. Israel says, well, yes, but what we want to do is to push Hezbollah out of reach of being able to target northern Israeli communities with RPGs and short range weapons and so on. Well, they can, first of all, they are still firing from southern Lebanon and they can continue to infiltrate it. But they, as I just said, they can hit it with much heavier weapons from farther away. So, and secondly, regardless of what the Lebanese and Israeli governments may or may not agree, Hezbollah is not going to disarm. And along with other Lebanese, if Hezbollah is disarmed, they will continue fighting to liberate their occupied territory. It's just almost a law of human nature. Secondly, and just as importantly, um, uh, the Lebanese arena has emerged as central to the negotiations regarding Iran. And Iran has insisted on a ceasefire in Lebanon um, as a condition for any agreement with the United States. And the Iranians are doing this for two reasons. Many people are focusing on the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah and that Iran is coming to the aid of Hezbollah and so on. And that's certainly an important factor. But I think as important, perhaps even more important from the Iranian point of view, is that they consider any agreement that they may reach with the United States in which the United States does not control the actions of Israel as essentially worthless. And the Iranians are saying, what's the point of having an agreement with the United States that ends armed hostilities if Israel is still free to bomb Lebanon and by extension will also continue to bomb Iran? So unless the United States demonstrates not only the capacity, but also the will to control its proxy that has been agitating for this war for decades and that is most invested in its continuation, the Iranians are unlikely to accept any agreement with the United States.
But will the United States show any sign of controlling its regional proxy? I don't see that happening.
Well, first of all, it will take no more than a phone call from Trump to Netanyahu to bring this about. So let's be clear that they have the capacity. There's no science or mystery involved in this. And if the Americans reach the conclusion that an agreement with Iran is necessary, they will do so. I have absolutely no doubt about that. The broader question is whether there will be an agreement between the United States and Iran. I mean, as we saw most recently in Islamabad, the parties are too far away, too far apart for an agreement. Now, there could be additional negotiations during the next week. Perhaps there will be a new eruption of Israeli-American attacks on Iran and Iranian retaliations and negotiations then resume, an agreement is reached. But another possibility is that there won't be an agreement because on the core issues, the parties are too far apart, but there will be informal understandings that while a number of issues remain unresolved, armed hostilities will come to an end. And that, again, from Iran's perspective, would have to include Lebanon to be credible. The broader question is that such an arrangement may, in principle, suit both the United States and Iran. But the question then becomes, does it resolve the underlying question? In other words, in the absence of a clear agreement between the United States and Iran, will insurance companies reduce their rates for oil tankers seeking to pass from the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean? If not, we maintain a massive unresolved problem.
Iran and the United States seem too far apart for any deal. For the previous nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, the United States and allies needed 2 years to negotiate. How in right mind could anyone expect that they are going to resolve all the current issues on the table just in 21 hours?
Well, precisely. And I think the most that could have been expected from that agreement would have been kind of, what's called a framework agreement or a commitment to negotiate further to resolve issues A, B, and C on whatever basis. But for reasons that remain unclear, the Americans backed out. There are some suggestions that the U.S. went to Islamabad with no intention of negotiating seriously. I think it's more likely that the U.S. went to Islamabad in the expectation that they were there to receive an act of unconditional surrender from the Iranians. And when they confronted an Iranian delegation that felt that it was actually in a stronger position now than it was before the war, despite the enormous damage that had been inflicted on Iran, they backed away. So I don't think if the Americans had been prepared to recognize reality in Islamabad, I don't think more could have been achieved than a formal commitment to negotiate further, perhaps even agreement on a set of general principles. But yes, these even a simple agreement on the modalities of a ceasefire and the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, for example, would have taken significant technical work. And when you're talking about issues like the nuclear file and so on, it would take at least weeks and most likely months to reach the level of detail required to have an agreement. But this is a problem of the Americans' own making. They had a very detailed agreement. They unilaterally renounced it in 2018. They had serious negotiations last year. They decided to use this as a cover for a military attack on Iran. And then they did the exact same thing once again in early 2026, where the Iranians thought they were negotiating seriously with the Americans, and the Americans used this to what do you call it, to deceive the Iranians and start an even bigger war against them. So obviously, the Iranians are going to approach the Americans as a party that cannot be trusted, that is perfidious, and that needs to give clear, irrevocable demonstrations of seriousness of purpose.
We are now in a strange situation that world depends on what President Trump is going to publish on his Truth Social. A couple of days ago, he announced that the U.S. Navy would block the Strait of Hormuz. That blockade is now in place. You recently said that the Strait of Hormuz is going to be for the United States and Israel what the Suez Canal crisis in the late 50s was for the British and France. Was this decision about blockade made thoughtfully?
You know, the problem here is that over the past month and a half, we have precious little evidence that the Americans have thought about anything. Um, Now, they want to impose a blockade on the Strait of Hormuz only for Iranian ships. Now, do you think the Iranians are going to accept that? They have already put forward the position that if it's blocked for them, it will be blocked for everybody. And if the Americans want to enforce this blockade rather than just proclaim it, they're going to have to bring their navy much closer to the Iranian coast than it is presently located. And that obviously creates new and important opportunities for the Iranian Navy if it seeks to escalate. You know, the only one who has carefully thought through this war, it's now clear, is Benjamin Netanyahu. From his point of view, you know, it's unclear to me whether he even believed his own propaganda or whether he was convinced that only if he was able to persuade Trump that a short, sharp war would be decisive and successful could he begin the process of a prolonged military campaign against Iran, which we may well be in the midst of now. But, the question now becomes who can absorb the greater punishment? Will Iran, if full-scale armed hostilities resume, will Iran continue to absorb the enormous damage that is being inflicted on it and on its population and on its infrastructure and industry and so on, because it feels it is fighting for its very existence and needs to turn the tables on the U.S. and Israel once and for all? Um, or will the U.S. be able to continue absorbing the enormous damage on its reputation, and more importantly, what is rapidly escalating into a global economic crisis in order to defeat Iran? And the point I was making is that if you look at what's happened thus far, and if you look at what's likely to continue to happen, um, the strategic position of Iran is likely to emerge stronger than it was at the beginning of this war. And the U.S.'s geopolitical position is likely to emerge weaker than it was at the beginning of this war. In other words, I think future historians will look at this war as the turning point in American imperial decline. And in that sense, if I am correct, and of course, it's too early to be definitive about these things, but if I am correct, it has many similarities to the 1956 Suez Crisis.
Just to go back for a second to this ongoing blockade, this isn't just about Iranian ships. What makes this situation more complicated is that blockades is imposed to any ship going to or from Iranian ports. That means 90% of those ships are Chinese. What happens if the United States Navy stops a Chinese tanker and says you're not going to pass?
Well, that's a crucial point. I mean, it's one thing, to target some rusty old oil tanker that is part of Iran's shadow fleet. But if you begin getting tankers flying under a Chinese flag, going to Iran to collect crude oil to ship back to China, what are the Americans going to do then? Is this going to turn into a superpower crisis between the United States and China? And here again, I am sure there are people in Washington who would like precisely this to happen, even though The Americans have just withdrawn so much military hardware from South Korea and Asia because they didn't anticipate, funnily enough, that they would need any of this equipment in the Middle East because it would all be over in less than a week. But yes, theoretically, this now has the possibility to develop into a massive global crisis. Again, when you're dealing with people as uninformed, as vacuous, as irrational as the current leadership in Washington, it's difficult to make to provide any serious analysis. But my sense is that the Americans and Iranians are probably going to resume their negotiations before the situation which you just asked me about materializes. But again, under current circumstances, I can't say that with real confidence.
We touched on these negotiations in Islamabad. Iran says that United States derailed a possible agreement. The US said that Iran's demands were impossible, especially regarding the nuclear part. You've been inside those rooms with the United Nations, with International Crisis Group. Based on what you are hearing, was there actually a deal on the table, or was this kabuki theater from the start?
I don't think there was a deal on the table that negotiators from the two parties had prepared for signature. What I do think is that there was a real possibility that these high-level meetings could have produced an agreement to negotiate seriously on the basis of defined terms of reference that subsequently, after sufficient technical and political and diplomatic work, could have resulted in a real agreement. But, we're dealing with people in Washington whose principle is instant gratification. Their idea of war is no different than someone else would look at a quickie. It has to be over very soon and enormously satisfying. So the question becomes, are we going to reach a point where the Americans recognize reality and come to an understanding that you can't resolve a 50-year dispute in 21 hours? Not only that you have now created the conditions where a deal that you renounced in 2018 because you said it was a terrible agreement is at most the very best that you can achieve in 2026. So I think the fundamental problem here is a refusal by the Americans to recognize reality and to keep changing that reality in ways that are more disadvantageous to them. If the Americans really want to change the strategic equation so that they can just dictate to the Iranians what any agreement would be, they would have to invest enormous resources into this war. They would have to send tens, if not hundreds of thousands of troops into Iran and actually seize significant Iranian territory and so on. There's no indication that the Americans are prepared to do that. There isn't even any indication that the Americans have the resources to do that if they should decide to do that. And even if they did decide to do that, and even if they had the resources to do that, there's no guarantee they would succeed. Now, does that mean the Iranians are going to win this war? No, of course not. I mean, Iran is facing the prospect of systematic destruction. But this is not a zero-sum game. This is rapidly turning into a conflict where there are multiple losers. I mean, you look at it so far, the main losers so far are not the Iranians, or not the Americans, or not the Israelis, but the Gulf states, who are not part of this war, who tried to prevent this war, who saw a war being launched in part from their territory without their consultation or consent.
And what the GCC countries can do at this point of time?
Well, very little. I mean, my impression, again, there's a lot of reporting about this, that the Saudis were urging the Americans to launch this war, that the Emiratis have been urging the Americans to escalate, and so on. I'm not really convinced by much of that. I mean, these are countries that, through bitter experience during the first Trump administration, recognized that in any major conflict between the United States and Israel, they would bear the brunt of the damage. They knew exactly what was about to happen. And my view is that they made a significant effort, all of them, including the United Arab Emirates, not just Oman, all of them, made a significant effort to try to prevent this war. And I think once they came to the conclusion that this was not a war they could prevent, they then decided to stay on side with the United States and allowed the United States to use basing facilities on their territory and their airspace and so on, because basically they felt they didn't have, the opportunity to outright reject U.S. demands the way, for example, Spain did. Well, look at what's happened to them. Um, and with a country like Saudi Arabia, you can say, well, yes, it has been seeking to transition to a post-oil economy, but at the end of the day, as long as it can continue to sell oil, it will be fine. Well, then you look at, a place like Dubai, um, which doesn't have oil and whose entire economy is based on the confidence of others, that is being now systematically destroyed as a result of this war. Will people return to Dubai? Or will, as some have suggested, now go to Milan or Singapore or wherever? I mean, this is a serious existential crisis, for some of them. So, the, they their alignment with Washington is based on the premise that the United States is the ultimate guarantor of their national security and stability. This year, they have learned that, in fact, the United States is a source of the largest threat to their national security. And not because of a war that the U.S. is fighting on behalf of their national security, but from their perspective, a war that the United States is fighting primarily on behalf of Israel without taking their own interests into account. At the same time, we're dealing with relatively small, relatively weak states that don't have many options. They can't just say, tell the Americans to leave. Will they start exploring more regional security architecture, including countries like Egypt, like Turkey, like Iran, and so on? Will they intensify the process of strategic diversification and seek to increase security ties with actors like Pakistan, China, Russia? We'll have to see.
Mr. Rabbani, as you know, in politics and in diplomacy especially, everything is messaging and everything is about messaging. You mentioned that the GCC really put an effort to calm down the situation to prevent this war. Oman, which was the mediator for the last negotiations before the war, was so sure that an agreement is going to be reached that the foreign minister, Badr al-Busaidi, went to CBS and said that the deal was within our reach. That was on February 27th. On February 28th, the US and Israel attacked Iran. What is the message to GCC countries that really tried to avoid this war and reach a deal?
You don't matter. You don't matter. We've taken a decision. We know as well as you do that this war is going to cause enormous damage to you, but we don't care because we don't have to care. We will do whatever we damn well please, and the consequences are your problem. I mean, as has been pointed out, these are countries that over the course of recent decades have purchased hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. weapons not necessarily to defend themselves, but to ensure that the U.S. would defend them. And the only country the U.S. invested serious resources into defending was Israel, which is a country that these states view as even more responsible than the United States for creating this crisis. Um, the message is quite clear. You don't matter. We will decide, and the consequences are your problem. Now, we also need to recognize, I think, that one can't talk about a unified GCC position. Different countries have different attitudes. So we've seen, for example, the UAE and Bahrain taking a relatively more hawkish position, but which is a consequence of the actions that Iran has taken in response to the U.S.-Israeli war against it. And then you have others like Oman and Qatar, and potentially Saudi Arabia as well, that have uh, put emphasis on de-escalation. And in Saudi Arabia's case, interestingly, they are also seeking to invoke the recent mutual defense pact that they have signed with the Pakistanis. And the Pakistanis have now sent a number of fighter jets to Saudi Arabia. I think this is a clear message to the Americans. We have options. Whether to what extent they can actually implement those options is, of course, a different question.
You've been writing about what you call a canification of Israel, the mainstreaming of extremist ideology. We saw a new death penalty law for Palestinians, only Palestinians, soldiers celebrating sexual assault of detainees. The military attorney general is dropping those charges. 77% of Israelis support a war against Lebanon. Is Israel collapsing within, at least morally, or is this a temporary fever?
Well, I don't really like to engage in these issues because, some people believe Israel is now in a state of moral collapse. Others believe that it began in 1982. I'm of the view that, um, a project to transform an overwhelmingly Arab territory into an exclusively Jewish state through mass ethnic cleansing and dispossession was morally rotten from the very outset. Um, but, over the decades, you did have a more liberal version of Zionism and a more, let's call it, atavistic form of Zionism. And it's quite clear that the latter has triumphed. And I would argue, given the nature of the Zionist project, this was always going to be the case, barring unforeseen circumstances. Uh, um, there's been a change of elites within Israel. I think the U.S. Analyst Jeffrey Aronson, actually in September of 2023, on the eve of the current crisis, wrote a very perceptive article in which he noted that Israel's traditional the traditional source of Israel's leadership has been the military. Many prime ministers or former military officers or military leaders and so on. But now you have new elites who are best personified by the Kahanist Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who emerged in opposition to the military. I mean, neither of them was accepted for military service because they were too extremist. And one of them is a convicted terrorist under even Israeli law. Um, and they want to transform Israel from, let's say, as it used to be called, an army with a state, um, into a state with a militia. They are proponents of a much more far-right, openly espoused radical racial state, if you will, compared to traditional Israeli elites. I mean, for them, Kahanism is an ideal to be put into practice, and they are doing it very successfully. Now, it's true, that the current leader of Israel is Benjamin Netanyahu, who comes from a Likud tradition, which itself was previously considered the extremist element of the Zionist movement. But, there's going to be elections this year. And you spoke about the death penalty law. And my interpretation of the death penalty law is the main motive behind it was not to kill even more Palestinians, but was a play by the Kahanist right for a greater slice of the electorate. We're openly proclaiming a new judicial process to kill Arabs because it is racist to do so. And they are expecting that they will get more votes from an increasingly extremist Israeli society for doing so. And I think they will be proven right.
Uh, we are also seeing something unusual inside NATO: hesitation, distancing, and even quiet resistance from European allies. Is this just a tactical disagreement, or are we looking at the deeper fracture inside the Western alliance? We saw a more or less disastrous visit of NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte to Washington. Some European diplomats are saying that NATO is not even capable of making any decisions, that it is practically finished, basically. Is it so?
Well, I think in practice, NATO is finished in the sense that the European members of NATO no longer have the confidence in the U.S. commitment to NATO. So although formally, of course, it continues to exist, even though Trump regularly makes announcements that he's considering leaving it, it's quite clear that the alliance, as it has existed since the end of the Second World War, is undergoing a transformation. And, this has to do with many factors, one of which is, of course, Ukraine, but it could be that the European refusal to join the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran, which, of course, it has absolutely no obligation to do under the NATO charter, could be the final nail in the coffin of this alliance. Now, of course, within Europe, there isn't a unified view, but there does seem to be a growing realization that Europe needs to begin developing an independent defense, national security that does no longer relies on the Americans as its primary guarantor. The question then becomes, will this also lead to shifting relations with the other superpowers or not? And that, I think, remains to be seen.
I was traveling through the region from Lebanon to Syria to Qatar to United Arab Emirates, and it hurts me to the core that the region looks on the verge of collapse. Before this, the region was more or less stable. Iran, according to American intelligence sources, was not able to make a nuclear weapon in the next 10 years, at least. Now we had an earthquake that I think people don't realize how big this earthquake was. What is going to be left out of the region once the ground settles?
Yeah, there's going to be much less left at the end than there was at the beginning. This is always a case with war, but it is particularly the case with wars where destruction, um, systematic destruction, is an openly espoused war objective. You see that now with Israel and southern Lebanon very clearly, to the point that Apple is removing entire villages from its map application. Um, you see that in, Trump threatening to end Iranian civilization to make sure it never reemerges and so on. Um, the Gulf, which has um, tried to, which has made its stability and security central to its strategy of transitioning to a post-hydrocarbon economy. That has now gone up in flames. Um, the region is undergoing a rapid transformation. transformations are never pretty, and they are often very ugly. And we're about to find out just how ugly in the coming months and years.
Mr. Rabbani, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
If you value long-form conversation that go beyond headlines and sound bites, consider to subscribe and support this project. It is because of the listeners like you that we are able to continue this backroom dialogue independent and in-depth. You can find the link to join in the show description. You've been listening Frontlines and Backrooms, and until next episode, keep looking beyond the noise.